Welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Professor Juan Cole, the proprietor of Informed Comment blog, professor at the University of Michigan, and author of the new book, The New Arabs. Professor, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
Just fine, thank you.
So I want to start by talking about the results of yesterday's elections in Turkey, and I think this is an interesting touch point for us to have this conversation. I remember actually, I think it was 2 summers ago, one of the first times I was hosting the Majority Report, in fact, you and I talked about the Gezi Square protests and this sort of emerging coalition on the left in Turkey to rein in Erdogan, prime minister then, president now. And it seemed like several months ago in regional elections that there was going to be a check on his AKP government. But yesterday, that did not hold up, and they won a very convincing victory. So we'll get into more details, but first just sort of run us through the results and your kind of basic takeaway of what happened yesterday.
Well, there's some dissatisfaction with the Justice and Development Party that's headed by Tayyip Erdogan.
Mm-hmm.
It's been winning elections since 2002 and winning majorities since then, except, as you note, last June 7th, where they came in with only 42% of the seats. So when a party in a parliamentary system rules for that long, there are always some discontents, and obviously even this time they didn't quite get to 50%, but they got it close enough to 50% that they can form a government without a partner.
Right.
So there are half the country won't vote for them, feels that they're somewhat high-handed and have moved away from some of their original promises about pluralism. But they have a lot of support in the center of the country, basically. And their heartland supporters came out in big numbers, concerned in part about security, and handed them this victory through 2019.
Yeah, and we'll get to the security questions, but I think it's always important. I think, and I know you and I have covered a bit of this ground before, but you mentioned that there's a contrast in his present leadership with some of the promises that the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, made around pluralism when they first came to office, which I believe was in 2002, and that basically, when this party first came into office, it was sort of, it wouldn't be the party that I would vote for necessarily. I'm a pretty left-wing guy and not particularly enamored of religious politics, but it was important because it was sort of an Islamic version of a Christian Democratic Party in Europe. And paradoxically, even though it was a kind of right-leaning religious party, it was a progressive force in Turkish domestic politics when it first came into office. Now, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, though, that Erdogan, and it's fair to talk really specifically about him as a personality because his sort of stamp on the party is quite strong and quite clear. There's certainly no real rival to him. That it seems like this sort of discourse about democracy and this discourse about pluralism was not internalized from the beginning. And it seems like this might be what's happened more recently is maybe more of a revelation of what the real project has been with him and the AKP government. I mean, do you think that's fair? You did call him the Ben Carson type figure recently.
Well, he started talking rather erratically and doing erratic things. He maintained in this election that one of his rival parties, the People's Democratic Party, which is pro-Kurdish,
right,
that its campaign was being run by Obama's campaign team. So apparently, David Axelrod has taken up residence in Diyarbakir I mean, it's just crazy stuff that he says sometimes.
Right.
And then he's developed this Napoleonic complex. He built this enormous presidential palace with 100 rooms, and he has this palace guard with representatives of what he calls the 16 Turkic civilizations, dressed in medieval style, that stand behind him.
I did that
So
at my
there's a kind
apartment recently, but I wouldn't overly read into it.
yeah, there's kind of grandiosity
Right.
to it. And then, he basically started talking as though Turkey is an elective dictatorship. That is to say, people have democracy to the extent that they can go to the polls and choose him. But then after that, they should sit down and be quiet. That ongoing protest or petition or political activity, criticism of him, and so forth is unwelcome. That it's just you can vote and then let him run things. And this kind of is not unheard of in the United States, but this kind of attitude is pernicious to democracy.
Right, and I think the next question to get to that's important is this, because there is this sort of conversation in the United States about Islam and democracy and conspiracies about Islam. It seems to me, I mean, is this the course he's taken, is that showing the sort of incompatibility of Islamic politics with democratic politics, which would be some people's interpretation, or is he really just reflecting a more traditional sort of specific problem to Turkey, which has also happened under secular leaders, which is a kind of electoral dictatorship, as you call it, or just a sort of strongman conspiratorial politics?
Yeah, I should underline that so far he hasn't done very much that's specifically Islamic.
Right.
He does have a constituency among believing Muslims, and obviously that's where his heart lies. And he does have a rhetoric of Muslim politics, but if you look at the legislative agenda of his party up until this point, and who knows what will happen in the future, it's really more center-right policies than anything else. And he hasn't, pursued a lot of the kind of cultural politics or lifestyle issues. They did make a law that you can't buy liquor after 10 p.m. from a liquor store. You can still get it in restaurants after that. And when there was protest about it, he said, well, if you're an alcoholic, go buy it beforehand and drink it at home. And then there's been debates about restricting abortion. So there's at the edges, some of that kind of thing. But actually, his party at the national level so far has enacted less in the way of legislation in support of religion, I would say, than has the Republican Party in the United States.
Right. And so moving into these security questions, if we go to another area where he sort of reversed himself in a really unfortunate way, he actually made some real progress with sort of soothing relations with the Kurds, and he gave some sort of expanded civil rights for the Kurdish population. He negotiated with armed Kurdish groups. Recently, that's been reversed entirely. And now there's, the PKK is engaging in terrorism again. The Turkish state is sort of drawing a direct equivalency between ISIL and the Kurdish fighters. And it seemed like in the same way that maybe he was reverting to type in many other ways as a kind of traditional Turkish leader, he was using the Kurdish issue as a wedge issue in the campaign and to kind of stoke nationalism. And I'm just wondering, with the results of this election, I mean, where do you see that dynamic going?
Right. So I think your description of it is accurate. I was in Ankara a couple of weeks ago. It was soon after the October 10 bombing of the pro-Kurdish peace rally.
Could you explain that bombing just a bit? Because it was horrific, but it kind of passed very quickly here in the United States.
Yeah, well, it was 102 people were killed and many more wounded. And I met people who had just come back from funerals of their or commemorations of their dead friends,
Yeah.
and so it was a big shock. We hadn't had any bombings of this magnitude in Turkey, and it's being blamed by the government on ISIL, and it is true that ISIL and the Kurds have a big fight because the ISIL territory in Syria includes Raqqa province, with the northern part of which is largely Kurdish, and the Kurds in the north have fought ISIL off and humiliated it, and so the argument is that an ISIL cell in Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey took revenge with this bombing, and another one earlier at Surut. But people on the left in Ankara are very suspicious of this government story about it, and there are dark conspiracies that somebody else was behind it, possibly even some force within the Turkish government. I'm not alleging this. I'm simply reporting the gossip that was going around Ankara.
Right.
So, in any case, obviously the Kurds were targeted in this bombing, but the general Turkish public outside of Ankara seems to have taken this and other incidents, because there have been 150 Turkish soldiers or police killed and 30 civilians by the more extreme PKK
Right.
Kurdish movement.
Right.
They've taken this as a sign that the country faces security challenges, and who better to solve Turkey's security challenges than Tayyip Erdogan?
Right.
So he seems to have picked up that extra 8% this time from people who were worried about security or worried about kind of Turkish nationalism. He seems to have taken votes away from a secular kind of extreme nationalist party, and then he picked up back up some support from conservative Kurds, and they had been part of his coalition because they're religious and vote culture rather than ethnicity. But in June 7th, the conservative Kurds, many of them had voted for a left-wing pro-Kurdish party, so they switched around their priorities this time.
Right. And this is actually a good question that will start to transition us into Syria. One of the paradoxes and another reversal with this Turkish government was that when they came into office, they talked about having a zero problems with neighbors foreign policy and a synchronized foreign policy, where they could basically, under the leadership of Erdogan and the Justice Development Party, they could, maintain great relations with the West. In fact, move closer to the West by joining the European Union, which was a goal of theirs, but also reestablish more presence across the greater Arab Middle East, maintain cordial relations with Iran and Syria. Clearly, over the last several years, that really shifted, and Turkey saw an opportunity, apparently, to establish itself in a different way outside of the sort of Arab uprisings in 2011. And the prime point for their influence and interference has been in Syria. And, with some, again, this is another sort of, alleged thing, but people go around a lot in Turkey with even people charging the AKP government, the Justice and Development government, with actually supporting ISIL, or certainly not being concerned about really extremist Sunni groups operating in Syria and potentially taking over. Is there a possibility, in light of the security problems that are coming back into Turkey, as well as, now we have U.S. Special Forces coming on the ground. All of a sudden, our two NATO allies going to be on the opposite sides of a proxy war in some indirect sense. Russia, obviously, there as well. Is this a time where Turkey might think about dialing it back and moving to a more conciliatory posture, if that's possible, in its regional relations in Syria, or are they going to stay the course?
Oh, I think that Erdogan got his majority in parliament, so he's going to continue with his foreign policy projects. I don't see his policies in Syria as so much opportunistic as they are reactions to the events there. He came to power on the back of support from small-town Sunni Muslims. Mm-hmm. And the small-town Sunni Muslims in central Turkey are not very different from the ones just south in Syria. They speak Turkish rather than Arabic, but so what?
Right.
So the civil war, the youth revolution in Syria began in 2011. Bashar al-Assad crushed it with tanks and artillery and sniping, and then it turned into a civil war when outraged Syrian Sunnis in the center of the country took up arms. And those are Erdogan's people who took up arms. He had tried to cultivate Bashar al-Assad, and they went on vacation together, and they had good relations. He didn't care that al-Assad is a secular Baathist. But when the Syrian government attacked these relatively peaceful protesters and drove them to take up arms, Erdogan had to make a choice. Is he going to let that stand, or is he going to fight back against it? And I think that it wasn't an option for him to let it stand, because people in Turkey who were very similar to the ones that were being killed by the Syrian government wouldn't have stood for it. That's his constituency. That's part of what's going on. Then the other thing was the Iranians are supporting, came in and became big supporters of the Baath party in Syria, and so Turkey had viewed Syria as a potential kind of economic satellite. It started doing a lot more trade with it, and so not only were Sunnis being killed, but now it was becoming an Iranian sphere of influence. So I think these were the kinds of considerations that led Erdogan to back certain forces in Syria, and the best fighters are Salafi hardline Sunnis, and although that's not, I think, Erdogan's cup of tea, as a pragmatic matter, I think he finally decided to make an alliance with the Saudis and to back the Salafis. And the Salafis shade off at the edges into Al-Qaeda, which, is disturbing. But again, from a pragmatic point of view, if they're good at killing Syrian soldiers, then you have no choice but to wink at that. So the U.S. has a completely different point of view on all this, and they, that's a red line for them, Al-Qaeda or ISIL or something. And they've taken up with the leftist Kurds in Syria as their best infantry proxy, and that drives Erdogan up the wall. He's very upset about that.
Right. That's another important. That's a really important point to underline, and it's not in any way a justification, obviously. But when we go back into the 1980s and talk about funding the Mujahideen and why Pakistan and Saudi Arabia would put resources and weapons and money into the hands of the most radical and the most militant and the most extreme of the Mujahideen. Maybe certainly some ideological affinity in some respects, but the main reason was the perception, and apparently often the accurate perception, that those were the best fighters. So it's a similar dynamic in Syria. And I guess, now we're seeing moves in Syria to, the U.S. has invited Iran into negotiations. Clearly the U.S. has somewhat softened its position, at least rhetorically, around Assad and whether or not he needs to go. But it seems like, just as you described with Turkey, in fact, within Turkey's sort of narrow and understandable sense of self-interest, even just going back to Erdogan protecting his constituency in some respects. Everybody inside this conflict is sort of acting from a place that is, quite understandable and rational within its context. Iran, in terms of expanding its influence, having a bridge into Lebanon, the Gulf states wanting to dislodge Assad, Russia backing Assad. From that context, and in this really disastrous situation, which appears to have no ready solution, I mean, what could possibly come out of new talks and diplomatic engagement when everything is so sort of locked in and preset? Is there any kind of path here?
Yeah, in my view, the most likely end to this civil war is a victory by somebody. But there have been situations in which these conflicts have ended without a victory, and not necessarily satisfactorily. But I lived in Lebanon in the early years of the civil war there, which lasted from 1975 to 1989. And by the way, that's typical of insurgencies of this sort. Once they get started, they seem to go about 15 years on average. In my own unscientific analysis of what happened in Lebanon was that the various factions once formed fought each other until it became clear that the next battle was not going to bring them any benefit. And then the big leaders were enticed to tie up in Saudi Arabia under Saudi patronage and made a peace deal with one another, which has more or less held ever since. You could argue that it produced a certain amount of gridlock in the settlement in Lebanese politics. It's not as if there's a strong government or an effective one, but mostly people have not taken back up arms, even under severe strains such as we're seeing now because of the fallout over Syria. And then they did make an exception for Hezbollah in the south, the Shiite militia, which they appointed a kind of national guard to guard the south against Israeli incursions. And that has morphed now into a kind of regional militia that's willing to strike into Syria.
Right.
But you could imagine a situation in which, not now, but down the road, Sunni and Alawite and Ba'ath and other leaders and Kurdish, so forth from Syria sat at a table somewhere in the Gulf or Moscow or someplace and made a set of commitments to disarm and to go forward, and so that's the best outcome you could hope for from these multi-party talks. But it's not going to happen right now because the people on the ground haven't come to that decision that I mentioned that occurred in Lebanon, where the next battle is not going to bring any more benefit. They still think they can win.
My final question then is, I'm reminded of a piece a couple years ago that the former South African president Thabo Mbeki wrote, and I think it was also he did an interview on Al Jazeera where he his argument was that the problem is that the Western focus is on justice, which he would probably put in air quotes, before peace. So that when we fixate on someone like Assad, who undoubtedly is a butcher and a horrific human rights violator, and we sort of go towards, well, he just needs to go, we misread the larger situation and conflict, and then we miss an opportunity to start having the type of conversation earlier that you're talking about. Now, obviously, he could be wrong. So my question is, was it a mistake to say Assad needed to go, or on the other hand, is it in fact a precondition for the type of process you're talking about?
The issue with Assad is that President Obama demanded that he step down in sort of May of 2011, and I think Obama did this more than once, and he did it with Yemen too. And I personally disagreed with him on this policy. I don't think you should demand that somebody step down if you're the president of the United States, unless you can make them.
Right.
Because then they don't step down and you look weak. And, Bush Sr. made this mistake with Saddam. And so I think it's all along a mistake to put out these kind of toothless ultimatums. And with regard to the negotiations, now the Obama administration, as you say, has revised its position and maintains that the talks can go forward towards elections without Assad stepping down. And if only Assad had elections in 2011, we could have avoided this massive tragedy which has affected the entire world. And now it's late. I mean, how would you hold elections in a condition of civil war? But sooner or later, it may be possible to start holding them, and that's one of the ways you could see going forward if Syria became more of a federal state, so that there was more states' rights and regional autonomy, and the strong Sunni areas could elect strong Sunni representatives to the Syrian parliament, and the Alawites could elect their delegates, and then they can all wrangle with each other and trade horses in parliament rather than duking it out with medium weaponry in the streets.
Right.
That's a possible end game here, but and that's another thing that the Russians have suggested they go to elections as early as next summer. One doesn't know the future. It seems to me early, but sooner or later, you may be able to get buy-in to such a plan. But the problem is that the Ba'ath Party that Bashar al-Assad heads is a one-party state and very manipulative and grasping, and they're like the old Stalinists. And people are afraid that they'll have show elections the way they have had a number of elections in Syria, but they've all been for show. And the Ba'athis managed to control everything. They have a secret police. They arrest people in the middle of the night. They've tortured 10,000 people to death.
Yeah.
Torturing 10,000 people to death is excessive. These are people who were already in custody. They were harmless at that point, and they were nevertheless tortured to death. To hope that such a regime can preside over dispassionate elections is a little bit a hope too far. But maybe steps can start being made in that direction. My guess is this goes on for another 10 years, and my best guess is that there's a military victory at the end of it by somebody. Okay. But you can't rule out the other possibility, which is to have some kind of civil society process that produces compromises and people start laying down their guns.
Well, Professor Juan Cole, we'll have to leave it at that. I really appreciate your time, and that's also quite a takeaway line, that torturing 10,000 people to death is excessive. That says a lot about what's happening in Syria today. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.